As in the rest of America, the 1960s in Boise represented a time of great change and modernization. Boise celebrated its centennial in 1963, marking a huge milestone for the city and state. What was once a small community in rural Idaho had become a bustling capital city, even achieving the status of official, standard metropolitan statistical area in 1962. After 100 years, Boise was on the cusp of a new frontier. With expanding businesses, a new four-year college, substantial government plans for expansion, and even plans for a green belt path along the Boise River that would eventually come to define the City of Trees. But in Boise, as in many other American communities, the 60s also represented a time of unease, with the realization that the best days of the past were no longer good enough, that urban problems threatened to overwhelm current optimism, and that government expansion might be based on false promises. And so, in the 60s, the city of Boise entered an unprecedented era of adjustment and change. For much of Boise's history, building and zoning regulations were loose, allowing for unregulated commercial sprawl. Headed by a bold new city rehabilitation program based on national ideas of urban renewal, developers sought to modernize downtown Boise, erasing years of unregulated commercial development, but also much of Boise's architectural history. The city created the Boise Redevelopment Agency, which promptly began to plan for tearing down older buildings and erecting a new vision of downtown that would amazingly include an 8-block enclosed mall. One group called for, quote, a new image. But as plans went forward, Harper's Weekly magazine even declared that Boise had an excellent chance of becoming the first American city to have deliberately eradicated itself. Certainly, Boise was growing at a rapid rate. Boise's population doubled from 1960 to 1970 as more people moved to the Treasure Valley. Even Boise's accredited learning institutions expanded in order to keep up with Boise's growing population. Boise Junior College, now known as Boise State University, achieved four-year status in 1965, a huge achievement for the city and the college. With an increased emphasis on education, the city was able to attract more professional staff, along with enriching the community with public programs headed by the college. Capitol High School was also constructed in 1965, not only representing a growing emphasis on education, but also the growth taking place in South and West Boise. On the national spectrum, the 1960s saw the escalation of the Cold War with the USSR. Idaho itself played an instrumental role during this atomic age. With key laboratories in locations like Arco, Idaho, the National Reactor Testing Station, later called the Idaho National Laboratory, played a vital role in the research and development of nuclear energy throughout the 1960s. Cold War fears about the possibility of nuclear attack brought Boise the construction of its own bomb shelter, built in 1961 at the base of the Highlands. The U.S. later became intent on exploring space, eventually succeeding in 1969 when NASA's Apollo 11 mission landed astronaut Neil Armstrong on the moon. Americans became infatuated with space and futurism during the 1960s, creating a culture centered on the wonders of space. Mid-century modern architecture expanded in Boise, reflecting the motor and space age of the time, as seen in the construction of modern motels along Capitol Boulevard, the Idaho Department of Transportation building, and the Boise Airport redesign. During this time, a new futuristic architectural style called Googie was developed in Southern California and became quite popular. Resembling space-age lines, everything from coffee houses to the Space Needle were included in the Jetsons-esque design. Locally, Googie had several examples, most prominently in the building of the new Sambo's restaurant. Boise's Sambo's, a national pancake chain, became a local favorite, but the chain fell out of favor in the 70s as its namesake was considered a racist slur, and the building is currently a teppanyaki steakhouse. This building is the last remaining specimen of Googie architecture in the Boise area. The building's characteristic upswept roofline and use of geometric shapes remains a great and unique example of futuristic influence on architecture. Another national trend that changed Boise's landscape was the growth of government spending on domestic programs by President Johnson's administration in order to create what he called the Great Society. These programs were ultimately only partially successful at remaking the American societal landscape due to Johnson's focus on the Vietnam War and the outpouring of protest against many of his policies. Boise didn't escape the debate over these issues, as both President Johnson and 1968 presidential candidate Richard Nixon visited Boise to find support. Government spending grew at all levels, as seen locally in the construction of a whole new state capitol complex over the course of the next 2 decades. Boise's population rise earned it a federal district courthouse in 1965, and its construction represented a growing modernist culture, embracing a movement forward, away from old traditions and looking towards the future. The courthouse serves as one of the best examples of Boise's modern architecture. When it came time for a district courthouse to be built, the initial plan was to place it near the planned 8-block Capitol Mall complex, yet plans went awry as state-owned land was dear in that area, and Fort Boise, a federal property, had land to give. Boise's own Charles Hummel, part of a federal design consortium that featured a designer at the Kennedy Space Center, put together a beautiful and modern new building that virtually floats on the pilotis spanning the first 2 floors. Despite being awkwardly tucked into Boise's north end and providing a dramatic contrast to the nearby O'Farrell cabin, the building clearly demonstrates how Boise finally achieved the prestige and population needed to obtain a federal courthouse. The 1960s served as a time of dramatic change for Boise as a whole. Fueled by a decade of scientific advancement, Boise embraced a growing modernist culture, welcoming the future. With the aid of an ambitious rehabilitation program, Boise was able to begin the process of renewal, bumpy as it was, and change itself both architecturally and culturally. In effect, the restructuring efforts of the 1960s allowed Boise to modernize, directly leading to the Boise landscape seen today.